A man bought a forgotten cabin for $1. He didn't know someone was already living there. He bought the cabin the same week they buried the man who used to own it, and nobody thought that was strange except Elias himself. The deed changed hands for $1, signed in a land office that smelled of pipe tobacco and old regret, witnessed by a clerk who didn't look up once during the entire transaction. The previous owner, one Harold Mercer, 61, found frozen on his own porch, had no surviving family, no debts worth collecting, nothing left behind except 40 acres of mountain timber and a structure that 3 separate county men had already declared uninhabitable. Elias Carter declared it home. He had his reasons. Most of them he kept to himself. It was the winter of 1883 when he rode north out of Billings with everything he owned split between 2 saddlebags and a mule that had better judgment than most men he knew. The trail into the Absaroka Range narrowed by the second day, then disappeared entirely on the third. He navigated by tree line and instinct, the kind of instinct a man develops only after he has lost enough times to stop fearing what comes next. The cabin sat at the edge of a frozen creek, half swallowed by pine. It was smaller than the deed suggested, and darker than the season warranted. The front door hung at an angle, one hinge rusted clean through. The window on the western wall was boarded from the inside, which struck him as odd, the kind of detail a man files away without knowing why. He tied the mule to a post, tested the porch boards with his boot, and pushed the door open. Cold ash in the stove, a tin cup on the table, upright, as though set down in a hurry. Dust on every surface except, and here he stopped, a narrow track along the far wall, floor level, like something had been dragged or someone had walked close to it recently enough that the dust hadn't yet settled back. Elias crouched down and looked at it for a long moment. Then he stood, unpacked his bedroll, and started a fire. A man who has come this far to be alone, he told himself, does not go looking for company in the walls. The storm came in after midnight, wind that didn't howl so much as press, a steady, suffocating weight against the timber, as though the mountain itself had leaned in to listen. Elias lay on the floor beside the stove with his rifle across his chest, not because he expected danger, but because old habits were the last things a man surrendered. He was almost asleep when he heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from behind the western wall. He didn't move, didn't reach for the rifle, just opened his eyes and stared at the ceiling while the sound crossed the length of the room and stopped, directly on the other side of the boarded window, close enough that he could, if he listened hard enough, hear breathing that was not his own. Harold Mercer, the land clerk had mentioned, almost as an afterthought, always said that cabin kept its own counsel. Elias understood now what the man meant. He waited. The breathing didn't stop. Where are you listening from today? Tell us your city in the comments below. There are men who come to the mountains because they are running. Elias Carter was not one of them. Running implies something still worth escaping. By the time he rode north out of Billings, there was nothing left behind him worth the energy of flight. No creditors, no warrants, no woman waiting at a window. Only the particular silence of a life that had been carefully, methodically emptied until even the echo was gone. He had been a surveyor once, a good one. The kind of man other men trusted to walk into unmapped territory and come back with something true. He had mapped 3 counties across Montana and Wyoming before the railroad money ran out, before the company folded, before his partner, Marcus Hale, rode off with the last of the equipment and the deed to the land claim they had filed together in both their names. He did not chase Marcus. That was the thing people never understood about Elias Carter. He did not chase. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice or his fist or make promises he intended to collect later. He simply noted the betrayal, the way a surveyor notes an obstacle on a map. Here is where the ground gives way, and adjusted his route accordingly. What looked like forgiveness was something quieter and more permanent. It was the decision to want nothing from anyone ever again. He was not bitter. Bitter men still cared enough to be angry. Elias had moved past caring with the same deliberate efficiency he brought to everything else. He bought the Mercer Cabin not as an act of despair, but as a final act of clarity. He had surveyed enough land to know that the most honest thing a piece of ground could be was simply left alone. He intended to extend that same courtesy to himself. Laya. Age uncertain. She will not say. The first thing Elias noticed when the panel finally shifted open in the gray light of the following morning was that she was not surprised to see him. He was surprised to see her. Deeply, thoroughly surprised, in the way that briefly empties a man of every word he has ever known. But she stood in the narrow dock of whatever space existed behind that wall, with her arms at her sides and her chin level, and her eyes holding the specific quality of someone who has been afraid for so long that fear has become simply the weather she lives in, passive, contained, already bracing for what came next. "I have been here since October," she said. Her voice was low and unhurried, the voice of someone who had learned to make very little sound. "I did not know anyone would come." "The deed transferred 3 days ago," Elias said, because it was the only true thing he could think to say. She nodded slowly, as though this explained something she had already half suspected. Her name was Laya. That was all she offered and all he asked, because Elias Carter understood instinctively the difference between privacy and deception, and what this woman was practicing was the former. She was not hiding who she was. She was protecting what remained of herself after someone had spent considerable effort trying to reduce her to nothing. He recognized the posture. He had worn it himself in a different shape. She was thin in the way that spoke of a winter spent rationing. Her coat was good quality once, wool, double-lined, the kind of woman of some means would own. But it had been repaired so many times along the left shoulder that the original fabric was now the minority. Her hands, when she finally moved to push a strand of dark hair from her face, bore the particular roughness of someone who had been doing hard work in cold conditions for months. She had been surviving in this cabin alone through the first storms of the season behind a wall, and she had been doing it quietly enough that Harold Mercer, when he was still alive, apparently never knew. Elias looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the stove, where the fire he had built the night before had burned down to coals still holding heat. "There's dried venison in the left saddlebag," he said, "and coffee. The pot's on the hook." He did not ask her to leave. He did not ask her to explain. He simply moved to the stove and began rebuilding the fire, his back to her, giving her the only gift he knew how to give a person who had been cornered: the choice of whether to stay. He heard her cross the room, heard the saddlebag unbuckle, heard her pour water into the pot with the careful, practiced economy of someone who had learned not to waste a single thing. Neither of them spoke again until the coffee was ready. It was the most honest conversation Elias Carter had held in 3 years. The first rule Elias established was simple. He would not ask, and she would not explain. Not yet. Maybe not ever. That was acceptable to him. What was not acceptable, and he discovered this on the second morning, when he found her attempting to patch the eastern wall with strips torn from her own coat lining, was watching someone continue to give pieces of themselves away to survive when the immediate crisis had passed. "Stop," he said from the doorway. She stopped. Immediately. Completely. The way a person stops when they have learned that not stopping carries consequences. That particular quality of stillness, too fast, too total, told him more about her history than anything she could have said aloud. He crossed the room, took the strips gently from her hands, and handed her his spare wool blanket instead. "The wall can wait," he said. "You cannot." She looked at the blanket for a moment, then at him, trying, he understood, to locate the cost. Every kindness she had ever received, he suspected, had eventually presented its invoice. "There is no condition attached to it," he said quietly. "It is just a blanket." She took it, did not thank him. He did not need her to. They found a rhythm inside a week. Elias handled the structural repairs, the broken hinge, the compromised roof beam on the eastern side, the floorboard near the stove that had rotted through and waited like a trap. He worked methodically and without complaint, the way a man works when the labor itself is the point, when the act of fixing something tangible is the only honest answer to all the things that cannot be fixed. Laya handled everything else. She cooked with the spare efficiency of someone accustomed to limited provisions, stretching the dried venison into stews that lasted 2 days, rationing the coffee with a precision that bordered on mathematical. She mended, she sorted, she found, in a rotted crate beneath the floorboards, 4 tallow candles and a rusted tin of salt that she treated with the reverence of discovered treasure. She also began, quietly and without announcement, to repair the hidden panel. Elias noticed but said nothing. He understood. The panel was not just a wall. It was the place she had survived. Whatever it meant to her, sanctuary, shame, the evidence of how low a person could be brought and still endure, it was hers to decide what to do with. She sealed it from the outside. He took that as a good sign. The storms came in rotations that December, 3 days of white silence, then 2 days of wind so severe the cabin groaned along its entire frame, then silence again. The mountain operated on its own logic, indifferent to human schedules and human needs, and there was something clarifying about that indifference. It made the small warmths inside the cabin register more sharply by contrast. The fire, the coffee, the sound of another person breathing in the dark. Elias had forgotten how loud another person's presence was, not in an unpleasant way, in the way that reminds you of the size of the silence you have been living inside. On the 9th night she spoke without being asked. "His name was Rowan Ashby," she said. She was sitting across the stove from him, hands wrapped around her tin cup, eyes on the fire. "He was a land agent out of Missoula. I believed him when he said he intended to marry me." Elias waited. "He had a wife already," she continued, "in Helena, 2 children. I discovered this after certain arrangements had already been made that could not be unmade." The fire shifted. A log settled. "I had nowhere to go that he could not follow," she said. "So I went somewhere no one would think to look." "The Mercer Cabin," Elias said. "Harold Mercer was my mother's cousin," she said. "He told me once, when I was a child, that if the world ever became too much, there was a room behind the western wall where a person could disappear for a while." A pause. He meant it kindly. I did not imagine I would ever need it literally." She looked up then, directly at him, for the first time since the morning she had stepped out from behind the panel.
"Your turn,"
she said. It was not a demand. It was an offering, the only currency two people stripped of everything else have left to exchange. Elias looked into his cup. "I trusted a man I surveyed land with for 6 years," he said. "He took everything we built together and filed it under his name alone. I let him." He paused. "That is the part I have not forgiven myself for. Not what he did, what I allowed." "You allowed it because you trusted him," Laya said. "Yes." "That is not a character flaw," she said quietly. "That is just what happens to people who are still capable of believing in someone." The wind pushed hard against the northern wall. The cabin held. Elias looked at her across the fire, this woman who had survived 4 months behind a wall on rationed provisions and sheer will, who flinched at sudden movements and measured kindness for hidden costs, who had just said the most generous thing anyone had said to him in years, and said it as though it were simply obvious, as though he deserved to hear it. "You should sleep," he said, because he did not yet have words for the rest. She nodded and pulled his blanket around her shoulders and closed her eyes. He sat by the fire for another hour, listening to the storm work itself out against the timber, thinking about what it meant that two people with no faith left in the world had somehow ended up in the same room, in the same winter, rebuilding the same broken structure from the inside out. He did not arrive at an answer, but for the first time in a long time, the question did not feel like a wound. It was Laya who first noticed that Elias talked to the cabin. Not in words, exactly. More in the way he ran his hand along a wall beam before deciding how to repair it. The way a doctor palpates before cutting. Not aggressive, not indifferent, but genuinely inquiring. As though he believed the structure had an opinion about its own healing, and he was courteous enough to ask. She watched him do it one morning from across the room and felt something shift in her chest that she did not immediately have a name for. Later, she decided the word was recognition. By the 3rd week of December, they had established, without discussing it, a set of arrangements that functioned with the quiet precision of a long-married household, which was remarkable given that they were two strangers who had exchanged perhaps 200 words total and shared nothing more intimate than a fire. Elias woke first, built up the stove, set the coffee on before she opened her eyes. He did this not because it was assigned to him, but because he had noticed, early on, that Laya's first moments of consciousness were her most vulnerable. The brief, unguarded seconds before her composure fully assembled itself, when her eyes were wide and her breathing shallow, and her hands already braced against whatever the day intended to bring. He gave her the coffee as something to hold on to. She understood what he was doing. She did not say so. But she began, in her own careful way, to return the gesture in kind, leaving his gloves by the door before he went out to work, noting without comment when he favored his left shoulder, setting his portion of whatever she had cooked slightly larger than her own, with the plate turned so the better pieces faced him. Small things, invisible to anyone who wasn't paying attention. They were both paying very close attention. The incident with the roof happened on a Tuesday. Elias had been working the eastern slope since morning, replacing the compromised shingles before the next storm cycle came in. Laya heard the sound, not a crash, more a sudden absence of sound where steady hammering had been, and was outside before she had consciously decided to move. He was on the ground beside the woodpile, sitting up, one hand pressed to his temple. The ladder lay across the snow 3 feet away. She crossed the distance between them without thinking about it. "Don't move," she said, kneeling in the snow beside him, her hands already at his face, turning it toward the light with a directness that surprised them both. She was not asking permission. The careful, permission-seeking version of Laya had apparently stayed inside by the fire. "I'm fine," he said. "You are bleeding," she said. "That disqualifies the assessment." He almost smiled. She caught it, the slight compression at the corner of his mouth, and felt it do something unreasonable to her composure. She helped him inside, cleaned the cut above his ear with water she heated herself, her movements precise and unhurried. He sat still for it, which told her he was either genuinely dizzy or had decided, somewhere in the last 3 weeks, to trust her hands. She chose to believe the latter. When she finished, she did not immediately move away. She remained where she was, close enough that he would have had to lean forward only slightly to close the remaining distance between them, her eyes still on the cut she had just closed. "Laya," he said quietly. "I know," she said, and did step back then, but slowly, the way a person steps back from something they are not yet ready to name but are no longer pretending isn't there. That night the wind dropped entirely. The sudden silence was almost louder than the storm had been. They sat by the fire longer than usual, neither of them reaching for sleep, both of them aware in the particular way of two people who have spent weeks carefully maintaining a respectful distance and have just, without agreement, closed it by several degrees. "Can I ask you something?" Laya said. Not a question in its inflection, more like a door opening just slightly to see if the air on the other side was safe. "Yes," Elias said. "Do you miss it?" she said. "The life before?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, "I miss the version of myself that believed it was enough," he said. "The life itself I don't miss. I miss being the kind of man who could be satisfied by it." She looked at him. "That is a very honest answer," she said. "I've run out of reasons to be otherwise," he said. He turned to look at her then, directly, the way he rarely did, not because he was indifferent, but because Elias Carter had always understood that sustained eye contact was a form of demand, and he refused to demand anything from her. "Do you miss yours?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I miss who I was before I learned to be afraid," she said finally. "I was not a timid person once. I had opinions about things. I argued." The ghost of something moved across her face. Not quite a smile, older than a smile. "I was apparently quite difficult." "I find that entirely unbelievable," Elias said. She did smile then, small, startled, as though it had escaped without her permission. She pressed her lips together to recover it, but it was too late. He had already seen it, and the seeing of it did something to his expression that he was not quick enough to conceal either. They sat with that for a moment. Two people who had spent years building walls, now sitting inside one they had built together, both of them slowly, privately, becoming aware that the structure they were repairing was no longer just the cabin. "I don't want to be afraid anymore," Laya said, quietly. Not to him, exactly. More to the fire, to the winter, to herself. A declaration with no audience requirement, but Elias heard it. "You don't have to decide that tonight," he said. But when you're ready—" He paused, looking for the right words and finding them in the simplest ones available. "I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him. Outside, the mountain held its breath. Inside, something that had been frozen for a very long time shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, with none of the violence of a thing breaking. More like ice at the edge of a creek in early March, when the melt begins not at the surface, but from the ground up, invisibly, until one morning the whole edge simply lets go and the water moves again. She did not say anything, but she did not move her chair closer to the fire before she slept. She moved it closer to him. It was the cabin that asked the question first, not in words.
In the way the western wall held heat differently after Laya sealed the panel, warmer, more even, as though the structure itself had been waiting for that particular wound to close before it could properly breathe. Elias noticed it one evening while running his hand along the timber, the way he always did, and stood there for a long moment with his palm flat against the wood, thinking about what it meant for a place to finally stop drafting cold through its own hidden spaces. He did not mention this to Laya, but he thought about it for several days afterward. The question arrived properly on a Thursday, in the middle of an argument about a door. The front door, the one that had hung at its broken angle since before Elias arrived, was finally ready to be rehung. He had milled the new hinge pin himself from a piece of salvaged iron, a 2-day process that Laya had observed with the focused patience of someone filing away a skill for future use. The rehinging itself should have taken an hour. It took 3, because they could not agree on which direction the door should open. "Outward," Elias said. "Structurally more sound. Easier to push open from the inside in an emergency." "Inward," Laya said. "In a storm, an outward opening door fights the wind. You'd never get it closed again." "The storm comes from the north. The door faces east." "Wind at this elevation doesn't observe cardinal directions." He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them had raised their voices. It was entirely too cold for that. But there was a heat to the exchange that had nothing to do with the argument, and both of them knew it. "You said," Elias said carefully, "that you used to argue." "I did," she said, with the ghost of that escaped smile from 3 weeks prior. "You were not exaggerating." "I was actually understating." He rehung the door to open inward, not because she had won the argument, though she had, but because watching Laya disagree with him was the first time he had seen her occupy her full dimensions, standing straight without the slight inward curl she carried like old armor, speaking with the precision of a woman who trusted her own reasoning, and he would have conceded every argument for the rest of the winter to keep her standing that way. He did not tell her this either. That evening she found him sitting outside on the porch steps despite the cold, looking out at the tree line where the last of the day's light was failing behind the peaks. She brought 2 cups of coffee and sat beside him without asking if he wanted company. He had stopped needing her to ask some time ago. She had stopped needing to ask. They sat in the specific silence of 2 people who have moved past the performance of comfort into the thing itself. "Can I ask you something?" he said, his own door opening this time. "Yes," she said. "When you came here in October," he said, "what were you intending to do after the winter?" She was quiet for a moment, her cup held in both hands, eyes on the darkening tree line. "I hadn't thought that far," she said. "Surviving the winter was the full extent of the plan." "And now?" She considered this with the same deliberate honesty she brought to everything. "Now I think about spring," she said. "Which is new.
He nodded slowly. I came here to stop, he said. Not to die, just to stop. Stop moving. Stop building things for other people. Stop surveying land I would never own. He turned his cup in his hands. I told myself I was choosing peace. I think now I was choosing absence. I mistook the two.
They feel identical from the inside,
Laya said. Until they don't.
Until they don't,
he agreed. The last light left the peaks. The cold deepened in the particular way it does at altitude after sunset, immediate and total, as though the temperature had simply been waiting for permission. Neither of them moved inside.
Elias,
she said. Yes.
Do you think a person can choose a place?
She said slowly.
After they have spent everything, learning to need nowhere?
He understood the real question underneath it. It was not about the cabin. It was not about geography or settlement or the practical mathematics of survival in a mountain winter. It was about whether the capacity for belonging, once starved long enough, once betrayed enough times, could actually regenerate. Whether the organ that allowed a person to say this, here, with this person, whether that could grow back once it had been removed. He did not answer immediately. Elias Carter had learned, late in life, that the questions that matter most are dishonored by quick answers. I think, he said finally, that choosing a place was never the real act. He looked at her. I think the real act is choosing to stay after you know its every flaw. After the first storm, and the second storm, and the roof that needs replacing, and the door that argues with the wind. A pause. Choosing it anyway, not because it's perfect, because it's become yours. Laya looked at him for a long moment in the blue dark of the winter evening, this man who had come to the mountains to want nothing, and had somehow become the most present person she had ever shared a room with, who gave her blankets without conditions, and coffee before she was fully awake, and the full, undemanding weight of his attention without ever making it feel like a debt accumulating.
You are talking about more than the cabin,
she said. I am, he said simply. She looked back at the tree line, breathed out slowly, her breath rising and dissolving in the cold air.
I don't know yet, she said, if I still know how.
That's enough, he said. Knowing that you don't know is further than where you were in October. She turned to look at him then, and in her expression was something he had not seen there before. Not the fractured smile, not the careful measuring, not the too fast stillness of a woman braced for consequence. Something rawer and quieter than all of those. Something that looked, tentatively and uncertainly, like the beginning of trust.
Come inside,
she said, standing, picking up both cups.
You'll freeze out here, and then I'll have to manage this roof entirely alone.
The structural concern is noted, he said, and stood. She held the door open for him, the inward opening door, her door, and for just a moment as he passed through, her hand brushed his arm, and neither of them moved away from it. The mountain held the cold, the cabin held the warmth, and somewhere between those two facts, two people were beginning the slow, unglamorous, necessary work of learning how to stay. The man arrived on a Wednesday, which was unremarkable. What was remarkable was that he arrived at all. Nobody found this cabin by accident. Elias heard the horse before he saw it,
A single animal, moving with the deliberate pace of something that had been ridden hard for several days and was making its displeasure known at low volume. He was splitting wood at the side of the cabin when the rider came through the tree line, and he set the axe down in the slow, unhurried way of a man who has decided that whatever is coming will be met standing still. The rider was well dressed for the mountain, too well dressed. Wool coat with a fur collar, good boots, leather gloves that had never seen a day of actual labor. He had the particular confidence of a man who had spent his entire life moving through the world as though it had been arranged specifically for his convenience and had not yet encountered sufficient evidence to the contrary. He pulled up 10 feet from Elias and looked at the cabin with an expression that was not quite possessive and not quite nostalgic, but somewhere between the two. The look of a man regarding something he had discarded and is now irritated to find still existing without his permission. "This is private property," Elias said. "I'm aware," the man said pleasantly. "I'm looking for a woman, dark hair, goes by Laya." He said her name with the casual ownership of someone referring to a misplaced belonging. "I have reason to believe she came this direction in the autumn." "You've come a long way on a reason to believe," Elias said. "I'm a motivated man." He smiled. It was a good smile, practiced, calibrated, the kind that had opened many doors. "Rowan Ashby, land agent out of Missoula." Elias said nothing. Inside the cabin, behind the newly rehung inward opening door, Laya had gone completely still. She had heard the horse, too. She knew, with the specific certainty of a person whose nervous system had been trained by months of hypervigilance, exactly who it was before she heard his voice. The sound of a single rider approaching with confidence rather than caution. That particular rhythm belonged to only one kind of man, the kind who had never needed to approach anything carefully because consequence had never been part of his personal geography. She stood in the center of the room and breathed. The old Laya, the October Laya, the one who had sealed herself behind a wall to become unfindable, would have already moved toward the panel, would have already been calculating the geometry of disappearance, measuring the space between herself and the hidden dark, ready to reduce herself back to nothing on the simple evidence of hoofbeats. She did not move toward the panel. She picked up the iron poker from beside the stove and stand. Not as a weapon exactly, more as a reminder, to herself, a physical argument against the part of her that still wanted to become very small and very quiet and wait for the danger to pass without her involvement. She was done waiting. Outside, Rowan Ashby had dismounted. He was walking a slow perimeter of the cabin with the proprietary ease of a man conducting an inspection of something he considers his eyes moving across the structure with an assessor's calculation. Logging condition, value, the specifics of what could be recovered. "Deed on this property transferred recently?" he said conversationally, as though he and Elias were discussing the weather. "Land office in Billings, $1. He glanced at Elias. "Unusual transaction." "Legal one," Elias said. "Entirely." Ashby paused at the corner of the cabin, looking at the eastern wall where the new shingles were still bright against the weathered timber. "Someone's been doing work on it." "That's what owners do," Elias said. Ashby smiled again, patient, unhurried. The smile of a man who understood that time was always on the side of whoever held the most options. "I don't have a quarrel with you," Ashby said, turning to face him fully. "I simply want to speak with Laya. There are matters between us that were left unresolved. I intend to resolve them." "What matters?" Elias said. "Personal ones." "She doesn't appear to want them resolved," Elias said, given the lengths she went to. Something moved behind Ashby's eyes. Not anger. Anger would have been almost respectable. Something more reptilian than anger. The cold recalibration of a man who has encountered an obstacle he had not accounted for and is now quietly reclassifying it. "You don't know the full situation," Ashby said. "I know enough," Elias said. The door opened behind him. Laya stepped onto the porch with the poker held at her side, not raised, not concealed, present. She stood in the doorway of the cabin she had survived inside and looked at the man who had made survival necessary. And she did not flinch, and she did not look away, and her hands were entirely steady. Ashby looked at her with an expression that cycled quickly through surprise, relief, and then something uglier that he covered almost immediately with the practiced warmth of a man who had made a profession of making people feel seen. "Laya," he said, and his voice carried the specific tenderness of someone who has learned to perform tenderness with technical precision. "I've been worried." "No," she said. "You've been inconvenienced." A beat of silence. The mountain absorbed it. "Come now," he said gently. This situation is not what you believe it to be. If you would allow me to explain—" "Your wife's name is Catherine," Laya said. "Your children are Thomas, 8, and Ruth, 6. You filed the land claim in Billings under your name alone in September, 2 weeks before you came to me with a proposal of marriage." Her voice was level and exact, the voice of a woman who had spent 4 months in a hidden room with nothing to do but reconstruct every deception in precise sequence and understand exactly what had been done to her. "There is nothing to explain. There is only what you did." Ashby's pleasant expression did not collapse. It simply became less necessary. The performance fell away in increments, like a man removing a coat he no longer needed indoors. And what remained underneath was the thing Elias had seen in his eyes from the beginning. Not malice, exactly, but something more dangerous than malice. A fundamental incapacity to regard another person as fully real. "You have nowhere to go," Ashby said, quietly, almost kindly. "Your family won't take you back. Not after. And you have no means, and no standing, and no—" "She has this," Elias said. Ashby looked at him. 40 acres and a sound structure," Elias said. "Deeded and legal. And she has my word, which in this county is worth considerably more than yours, that if you return to this property for any reason, I will make the details of your arrangement in Missoula known to every land office between here and Helena." He paused. "I surveyed this territory for 11 years. I know every man whose signature matters in this region. Think carefully about whether that is a complication you want." The mountain was very quiet. Ashby looked at Laya once more. A last attempt at the performance, the soft appeal to shared history, to the version of their story where he was not the villain, where she was simply a woman who had misunderstood a complicated situation. She looked back at him with the clear, unafraid eyes of someone who had already paid every price this man could extract, and had survived it, and was standing in her own doorway holding an iron poker and had absolutely nothing left to lose. He looked away first. He remounted without another word, rode back the way he had come, through the tree line, gone into the white distance of the mountain. Not dramatically, not with any acknowledgement of defeat, simply gone the way men like him go when the calculation no longer favors them. As though the entire encounter had been a minor administrative matter, now closed. The sound of hoofbeats faded. The wind came back in to fill the space he left. Laya stood on the porch for a long moment after he had gone, poker still at her side, eyes on the tree line. Her breathing was audible now, not the shallow, bracing breath of passive fear, but something fuller, slightly ragged at the edges, the breathing of a person who has just discovered what they are made of and is still absorbing the information. Elias came to stand beside her, close enough that his arm was against hers. He did not say, "You were brave." He did not say, "It's over now." He did not say anything that would reduce what had just happened into something manageable and small. He simply stood there, solid and unhurried, while she found her way back to steady ground. After a long time, she lowered the poker. "He'll go," she said. Not a question, an assessment. "Yes," Elias said. "Men like that only stay when it costs them nothing. You just made it expensive." She nodded slowly. Then she turned and walked back inside, and after a moment Elias followed, and she put the poker back beside the stove in its proper place. Not because it was no longer needed, but because the woman who had picked it up had finally, irrevocably, decided she was done being the kind of woman who needed to hide. The door closed behind them, the inward opening door, hers. Spring came to the Absaroka Range the way forgiveness comes, not suddenly, not announced, but discovered one morning in the quality of the light. Elias noticed it first in the creek. The ice at the eastern bank had pulled back overnight, just a few inches, exposing dark water moving beneath. He stood at the tree line watching it for a long time before he understood why it mattered to him. Things were letting go. They had not spoken about what would happen in spring, not directly. The way two people who have survived something together sometimes cannot bring themselves to name the future aloud, as though language applied too early might disturb the fragile thing still setting into its final shape. But it was present between them constantly, the question of spring. In the way Elias began reinforcing the roof on the western side, work that would outlast a single season. In the way Laya had started a kitchen garden plan in the margins of an old survey map she'd found in the crate beneath the floorboards. Small pencil marks, rows and spacing, the specific optimism of someone who intends to be present at the harvest. Neither of them pointed these things out to the other. Both of them saw. On the first genuinely warm afternoon, Laya went outside without her coat. Elias watched her from the porch, this woman who had arrived in his cabin as a voice behind a wall and had become, across the length of one Montana winter, the most essential feature of the interior landscape. She was standing in the clearing with her face turned up toward the sun with her eyes closed, entirely unguarded, entirely present. And he understood that he was witnessing something private. Not private from him, but private in the way that a person's return to themselves is always private, regardless of witnesses. He did not interrupt it. He just watched, and felt something in his chest that he had no surveyor's language for. No coordinates, no elevation markers, no notation adequate to locate it on any map he knew how to make. He had come here to want nothing. He was no longer interested in that particular ambition. He found her that evening sitting on the floor in front of the western wall, not against it, not hiding, simply sitting cross-legged before the sealed panel with her hands in her lap, looking at it the way a person looks at something they have finished grieving and are now simply regarding, without fear, without bitterness, with the clean, uncomplicated attention of someone who has arrived at the far side of a thing. He sat down beside her. The fire behind them threw their shadows long against the opposite wall. "I used to count the boards," she said. "From the inside, there were 11. I knew every knot in every one." He said nothing. "I thought about you," she said. "Before you came, I heard riders sometimes, at a distance, and I would think, whoever that is, they are free in a way I am not." A pause. "I did not imagine I would ever say this, but I am glad it was you." "So am I," he said. She turned to look at him, close in the firelight, with no distance left between them that either of them had put there deliberately. "I don't know how to do this," she said, quietly, honestly. "I want to. I have not wanted anything in a long time, and wanting this frightens me. And I think you should know that." "I know," he said. "And you're staying anyway," she said. "I already told you," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." She held his gaze for a long moment, measuring nothing this time, calculating no hidden cost, simply looking at him the way a person looks when they have finally decided that the risk of staying is worth more than the safety of leaving. Then she leaned forward and kissed him. Brief, certain, the kind of kiss that is not an experiment, but a decision. When she pulled back, her eyes were open, and her expression was not soft exactly. Laya did not do soft, had never done soft, and he loved that about her. But it was open, fully, finally open, the way the creek had opened that morning, the ice releasing from the bank and the water moving again. "There," she said quietly, as though she had just fixed something. Elias looked at her for a moment. "There," he agreed. Later, when the fire had burned low and the cabin had settled into its nighttime silence, Elias woke to darkness and lay still, listening. The mountain was quiet. The wind was quiet. Laya's breathing beside him was slow and even, the deep, unconscious rhythm of someone who had finally, after a very long time, stopped listening for danger even in sleep. He closed his eyes. Then he heard it, a sound from the western wall. Not footsteps this time, softer than that. The specific, almost imperceptible sound of wood shifting. The slight give and release of a panel that has been sealed all winter, beginning, in the new warmth, to breathe. He opened his eyes and looked at it in the dark. The panel had not opened, not fully, just enough. A hairline of deeper shadow along its edge, a seam between what was hidden and what was not. He lay there looking at it for a long time. The old question rose. Was the cabin waiting for Laya? Or was Laya waiting for Elias? Or had the whole arrangement been decided before either of them had any say in it? And this time he let the question sit without demanding an answer from it, because he had learned, across the length of this particular winter, that some structures are not meant to be fully mapped. Some things hold more truth in the not knowing. He reached out and placed his hand flat against the western wall. The timber was warm. He left his hand there until he fell back asleep. In the morning, the panel was as they had left it, sealed. But the room was warmer than it had any reason to be. Every time I read your comments, I'm reminded that a story told in the mountains of Montana in 1883 can find its way to someone sitting alone on the other side of the world and make them feel a little less alone. That is not nothing. That is everything. Where in the world are you reading this? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if you still believe that two broken people can find their way back to warmth, Don't go anywhere. The next story is already waiting for you.